what we're looking at here is the three major nutrients that go into all fertilizer. These numbers here are the percentage that the United States imports. You'll notice for nitrogen and phosphate, we're pretty much self-sufficient. Our problem is potash. But 90% of the potash we get, you can't really read that, but this is Canada. So, they're good for something. We only get 12% of one sliver from the conflict zone. Brazil gets over 80% of its fertilizer from the Russian space. Australia, it's about half. Oh no, it gets worse. Because the rest is roughly evenly split between China and the Middle East. Isn't it crazy? We've forgotten about the Middle East that soon. Spoiler alert, it hasn't gotten any better. And now that the United States is no longer in the middle of all of it, the Saudis and the Iranians are really looking forward to having a nice, dirty little war. And so everything that we've ever thought was a problem with the Middle Eastern energy is a problem with the Middle Eastern energy, but not for us because of the shale revolution.
American involvement with Myanmar, Thailand, and Singapore raises potential solutions to the economic problem raised by America's possible interest in Taiwan and Korea. Those solutions are Australia and New Zealand. Between them, they are low to mid-cost, reliable producers of nearly every significant industrial and agricultural commodity under the sun. Oil, natural gas, coal, uranium, aluminum, wheat, fruits, vegetables, dairy, beef, and lamb. There is no more perfect mating to the resource-poor and hungry states of Taiwan and Korea than the Anglos of Australasia. While a commitment to keep trade lanes to the Middle East might be more than the Americans are interested in, commitment to keep the far shorter and less fraught lines to political and cultural mates in Australia and New Zealand would be comparatively simple. The pair are also so physically removed from the Asian mainland that the defense commitment required to maintain their sovereignty would be minimal. American involvement in Australasia would also solve, at least partly, Singapore's problem. A web of trade among the United States, Korea, Taiwan, Myanmar, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand would put Singapore smack in the middle. In the middle, along with Singapore, would be its current economic partners: the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Higher temperatures in Australia have manifested as hotter, drier summer days. In the summer of 2019 to 2020, Australia experienced a drought, complete with borderline apocalyptic bushfires that burned down 1/5 of the country's forests, killing something like 1 billion animals and destroying roughly 1/7 of the country's rangelands. A swirl of a dozen major ocean currents surrounds the Australian continent. Some warm, some cold, some seasonal. Australia's far north is firmly in the tropics. The far southeast edges into the cold side of the temperate zone. The result is a land of contrasts. Not only is the middle 3/4 of the Australian continent hard desert, but wild climactic variations from season to season and year to year curse Australia with a jagged flood and drought pattern. It is as if the great Australian deserts pulse like a heart, with precipitation patterns surging into and away from the interior every few years. The Aussies, in that wonderful way they have with words, call these phases the big wet and the big dry. Such patterns were well documented long before the accelerating carbon builds in Earth's atmosphere of the post-1990 world, or even before the Aussies began industrializing. This isn't climate change. This is Australia. Now add in that 1.1 degrees Celsius temperature increase. Australia's topographic layout makes it arid. Dry air heats quickly, but also cools quickly. Most of Australia's temperature increase, therefore, manifests as higher daytime temperatures. That raises the dew point, making rain less likely. This dries the country out and makes it drought and fire prone, decreasing agricultural potential. Many of Australia's agricultural regions, most notably the western slopes of the Blue Mountains in the country's east, and significant portions of the Murray-Darling Basin in the southeast, are likely to degrade into dust bowls. The fires of 2019 to 2020 have a very harbinger of the apocalypse feel to them. With the combination of a fairly diversified economy, government policies welcoming immigration, and a bevy of mineral resources big enough to feed insatiable Chinese demand, Australia has avoided recession for a generation. Others noticed, and foreign money has spammed into the country to take advantage of the longest continuous period of economic growth in human history. That has turned the Great Down Under into the most over-credited of the Western countries to not yet experience a credit collapse. Credit has increased sixfold since 2000. Housing and household debt are, of course, the expected bugaboos, but the credit inflows have pushed the Australian dollar up to uncomfortably unsustainable highs, eroding the competitiveness of every economic sector outside of mining. Any effort the government has taken to decrease demand with regulatory hammers has been overwhelmed by a tax code that not only encourages property ownership, but in fact encourages those already owning residential property to purchase more. This would be a problem anywhere, but in Australia it is particularly acute. Oz might seem like a place with a lot of land, but the outback is beyond useless to residential real estate. The vast bulk of the Aussie population lives in fewer than 10 largely disconnected metro regions, sharply limiting availability and driving up the cost of building new housing inventory. This will blow. The question is when.
There's been some really fun news out in the last few days. Specifically, I'm talking about the new deal between the United States and the United Kingdom to provide new military equipment to the Australians. Now, this abrogates a deal that the Australians had with the French and provides the possibility of the Australians getting some nuclear-powered submarines. So, I mean, it's a very, very sexy story. It's got submarines, and it's got nuclear propulsion. It's got the French getting pissed off. I mean, there's something for everybody here. And, of course, everybody in France is all up in arms, and everyone in America is like, oh, we had no idea there was a deal. There's a lot of stupid diplomacy going on, and it's just hot, hot, hot. Everyone, of course, is looking at the wrong thing. This is not just a deal about providing Australia with some very high-end submarines that'll either be the Virginia class or based off of them. This is a broader technological exchange in military technologies among the Australians, the United Kingdom, and the United States, of which nuclear-powered submarines are only one small part of it. A far bigger piece is that the Australians will very soon have air and sea launched cruise missiles, some of which have a range in excess of 1,500 miles. And that makes this deal all about China. Now, for those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that I really don't worry about the Chinese at all from a strategic point of view. Yes, they've got a lot of ships in their navy, something like 600-700, but only 10% of them can sail more than 1,000 miles from shore, and that assumes no one's shooting at them. So they really only have a handful of ships that can go a long distance that's necessary to project any sort of power, and it's not enough ships to project power. So you put that into the context of what's happening here. Right now, the United States can wipe the floor with the Chinese Navy anytime, anywhere, except inside of the Chinese homeland. The Japanese can do it in the deep sea, no problem. The Indians can do it in the Indian Ocean. But everyone else is either too far away, or they're a local power so that the Chinese can bring their air force to bear. That means powers that actually punch well above their weight, like Korea or Singapore or Taiwan, can only take on the Chinese if they're willing to suffer some very serious blows to the homeland, and honestly that goes for the Japanese as well. So it's really just India and the United States. Until now. Australia is over 3,000 miles away from the Chinese coast. The Chinese don't have weapon systems that can strike in any meaningful volume at that range. I mean, if they took their entire long-reach navy, the very, very small handful part, and sailed it all at Darwin, they could do a lot of damage. But the Australians now have the ability to launch weapon systems from their homeland, not even using their outlying islets, from their homeland, and strike Malacca. Which means that Australia is now one of 3 countries on the planet that can shatter Chinese supply lines in the Chinese political and economic system. Because China is 100% dependent upon accessing raw materials the world over and accessing markets the world over. And now Australia has the capacity to interrupt shipments through Malacca, which means that tiny Australia with 26 million people now has China by the throat. That is the biggest geopolitical development of the year.